The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, but Eleanor Whitmore barely noticed. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the marshal's office, her substantial frame rigid with determination, her gloved hands clutching her reticule until her knuckles ached. Inside that building, they were preparing to hang a man at dawn. Eleanor had heard the whispers, of course. In a town this small, gossip traveled faster than wildfire through dry prairie grass. The new stable hand at the Twisted K Ranch, a quiet man who kept to himself, who'd arrived in town 6 weeks ago with nothing but the clothes on his back and calluses that spoke of hard labor, stood accused of stealing cattle from the very ranch that employed him. She'd seen him once, briefly, when she'd driven her father's wagon past the ranch on her way to deliver preserves to the widow McKenna. He'd been breaking a horse in the corral, moving with a grace that seemed at odds with his worn clothing and dusty appearance. When he'd glanced up, his eyes, a startling shade of gray like storm clouds over the plains, had met hers for just a moment, before she'd looked away, heat flooding her cheeks. Eleanor Whitmore, at 32 years old, was well past the age when men's eyes followed her. Not that they ever had, not really. She'd been a plump child who'd grown into a heavy woman, and in a world that prized delicate waists and graceful figures, she'd learned early to find her worth in other places. She could manage accounts better than most men, could organize a church social with military precision, and could out-negotiate even the shrewdest merchants when it came to purchasing supplies for her father's general store. But she couldn't remember the last time a man had looked at her the way most men looked at other women. Still, something about the condemned man's situation didn't sit right with her. The evidence was circumstantial at best, some missing cattle, a stranger in town, and the convenient testimony of Cyrus Blackwood, foreman of the Twisted K, who claimed he'd seen the man driving the cattle north toward the border. Eleanor knew Cyrus Blackwood. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew him. He was a hard man with wandering hands and a mean streak that grew wider with each passing year. She'd had to discourage his attentions more than once, and each rejection had left his expression a little colder, his words a little sharper. She'd also heard the rumors about the Twisted K owner, a man named Nathaniel King, who supposedly lived somewhere back east and left the running of his substantial holdings to Blackwood and a series of managers. The ranch had been declining for years, cattle disappearing, good men leaving for better prospects elsewhere. The door to the marshal's office opened, and Tom Brennan stepped out, his weathered face creased with lines of worry. He'd been marshal of Redemption Creek for 20 years, and Eleanor had known him all her life. "Miss Eleanor," he said, tipping his hat, "this isn't a place for a lady this evening." "Marshal Brennan." She straightened her spine, meeting his gaze squarely. "I'd like to see the prisoner." His eyebrows climbed toward his hatband. "Now, Eleanor, I don't think—" "It's a simple request, Tom." She gentled her voice, using his Christian name the way she had when they were children, and he'd shown her how to skip stones across the creek. "Surely there's no harm in it." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. 5 minutes, and I'll be right outside the cell door." The prisoner was sitting on the narrow cot when she entered the cell area, his head bowed, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. He looked up at her approach, and she saw surprise flicker across his features that, even in the dim light of the oil lamp, were far more refined than she'd expected for a drifting ranch hand. He stood quickly, instinctively, the way a man raised with manners would. He was tall, she noticed, and though his clothes were rough and his face shadowed with several days' worth of beard, there was something in his bearing that spoke of breeding. "Ma'am," he said, quietly. Eleanor glanced back at the marshal, who'd positioned himself just far enough away to give them the illusion of privacy. She moved closer to the bars. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I understand you're to hang at dawn." His jaw tightened. "Yes, ma'am." "Did you steal those cattle?" Those gray eyes met hers directly, and she saw no deception in them. "No, ma'am, I did not." "Then who did?" A muscle worked in his jaw. "I have my suspicions, but no proof, and my word against Cyrus Blackwood's carries no weight in this town." Eleanor nodded slowly. She'd expected as much. "What's your name?"
He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Nathan Carter. Well, Mr. Carter, I have a proposition for you. His eyebrows rose slightly. Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. What she was about to suggest was outrageous, improper, and possibly the most foolish thing she'd ever done. But she couldn't shake the certainty that an innocent man was about to die, and she had the power to prevent it.
There's an old Texas law, rarely used anymore, that allows a condemned man to escape execution if a woman of good standing agrees to marry him and take responsibility for his behavior. She watched his face carefully. I'm prepared to invoke that law on your behalf. He stared at her as if she'd just suggested they fly to the moon. Miss Whitmore, why would you do such a thing? Because I don't believe you're guilty. She lifted her chin. And because I don't believe in hanging innocent men. You don't even know me. No, she agreed. But I'm a good judge of character, Mr. Carter, and I have resources. My father's store, our house on the edge of town. You'd have a place to live, work if you wanted it. We'd work out the details of the arrangement. She paused, then added with brutal honesty, I have no illusions about what this marriage would be. A business arrangement, nothing more. You'd be free to leave once enough time has passed to make it seem respectable. He moved closer to the bars, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. Miss Whitmore, I can't ask you to sacrifice yourself this way. You're not asking, I'm offering. She met his gaze steadily. I'm 32 years old, Mr. Carter. No one has ever wanted to marry me, and no one ever will. At least this way, I'd be saving a life. That seems a fair trade for a wedding ring I never expected to wear anyway. The words came out more matter-of-factly than she'd intended, without the bitterness she sometimes felt late at night when she was alone. But she saw something flicker in his expression. Anger, perhaps, or pity. She wasn't sure which would be worse. I won't lie to you, he said finally, his voice low and rough. If you do this thing, there are people who won't be happy about it. Powerful people. You could be putting yourself in danger. I can handle danger, Mr. Carter. He stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself not to look away, not to fidget under that penetrating gray gaze. Finally, he nodded slowly. Then I accept your offer, Miss Whitmore, and I swear to you, on whatever honor I have left, that I'll do everything in my power to be worthy of this sacrifice. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, though whether it was relief or terror, she couldn't say. I'll speak to Marshal Brennan, she said. We'll arrange for the ceremony tonight. As she turned to go, his voice stopped her. Miss Whitmore, thank you. Not just for my life, but for... He hesitated, seeming to search for words. For seeing me as innocent until proven guilty. That's a rare gift. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and walked back out into the evening air. Behind her, she could feel his eyes on her back, and for the second time in her life, she wondered what Nathan Carter saw when he looked at her.
The wedding took place 2 hours later in Marshal Brennan's office, witnessed by Tom and Eleanor's father, George Whitmore, who'd arrived breathless and bewildered after Eleanor had sent word of her intentions. Ellie, girl, what in the name of heaven are you thinking? Her father demanded, his round face flushed with concern and confusion. Eleanor took his work-worn hands in hers. Papa, I'm thinking that an innocent man shouldn't die, and I'm thinking that this might be the one truly important thing I do with my life. George Whitmore looked at his only daughter, at the determination in her eyes that reminded him so much of her mother, and sighed. You're sure about this? I'm sure. Then I suppose there's nothing more to be said. He squeezed her hands. Your mother would be proud of you, Ellie, and so am I. The ceremony itself was brief and awkward. Reverend Matthews, roused from his supper, performed the service with visible reluctance, clearly disapproving but unable to refuse when presented with the legal precedent Eleanor had discovered in her father's old law books. Nathan Carter had been allowed to wash and shave, and standing next to Eleanor in the lamplight, he looked almost like a different man. Clean-shaven, his features were strong and angular, his jaw firm, his nose slightly crooked as if it had been broken once and healed imperfectly. He was, Eleanor realized with a start, handsome in a rough, weathered way. When it came time to exchange vows, his voice was steady, his gray eyes serious as they met hers. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the simple gold band, her mother's ring, hastily retrieved from her jewelry box, onto her finger. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Matthews said, his tone suggesting he was pronouncing a death sentence rather than a marriage. "You may kiss the bride." Nathan's gaze flickered to Eleanor's, questioning. She gave the tiniest shake of her head, and relief, or was it something else, crossed his face. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. The gesture somehow more intimate than any kiss on the lips might have been. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Mr. Carter." As they left the marshal's office, Eleanor was acutely aware of the stares from the few townspeople still on the street. News would spread quickly. By morning, everyone in Redemption Creek would know that Eleanor Whitmore had married the condemned cattle thief. She led Nathan to her father's house on the edge of town, a modest but well-kept structure with a wide front porch and a view of the prairie stretching out to the horizon. Her father had tactfully decided to spend the night above the store, giving them privacy Eleanor wasn't entirely sure she wanted. Inside, Nathan stood in the parlor, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Eleanor busied herself lighting lamps, suddenly nervous now that they were alone.
"I've prepared the spare room for you," she said, keeping her voice brisk and businesslike. "It's small, but comfortable enough. There are clean clothes in the wardrobe. They were my father's, but he's lost weight these past few years. They might fit you tolerably well." "Miss Whitmore." "Eleanor," she corrected. "We're married now, after all." "Eleanor." He said her name carefully, as if testing its weight. "I meant what I said earlier. There are people who won't be happy about what you've done, Cyrus Blackwood chief among them. Why would Cyrus care whether you live or die?" Nathan moved to the window, looking out at the darkening prairie. "Because I'm the only one who knows he's been stealing from the Twisted K for years, selling off cattle, pocketing the money, and blaming it on bad management or hard winters. When I showed up and started asking questions, he needed to get rid of me quickly. But why would he have you condemned for the very crime he's committing? Because he's arrogant." Nathan turned back to face her. "And because he thought no one would question the word of a ranch foreman against a drifter with no ties to the community." Eleanor sank into her mother's old armchair, her mind racing. "You're not really a drifter, are you?" A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "What gave me away?" "The way you stand, the way you speak. You're educated, well-bred." She studied him carefully. "Who are you really, Nathan Carter?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor could see him weighing his options, deciding how much truth to tell. Finally, he moved to sit across from her, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped between them. "My full name is Nathaniel Kingston Carter. The Twisted K Ranch belonged to my grandfather, then to my father. When my father died 5 years ago, it came to me." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You own the Twisted K?" He shook his head. "On paper, but I'd been living back east, managing family business interests there. I left the ranch in the hands of managers and foremen, sending money when needed, but never visiting." His jaw tightened. "I received letters, of course, reports of declining cattle numbers, of accounts that didn't quite add up, but I was too busy, too focused on other things to pay proper attention. Until
Until 3 months ago, when I received word that the ranch was on the verge of collapse. Cattle rustling had become so bad that we couldn't sustain the losses. I decided it was time to see for myself what was happening. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I came here in disguise, as a drifter looking for work. I thought I could observe without being noticed, gather evidence, figure out who was responsible. But Cyrus Blackwood figured out who you were.
I don't think he knows I'm the owner. But he realized I was asking too many questions, paying too much attention to the cattle numbers and shipping records. He decided to eliminate the problem before it became serious. Eleanor sat in silence, absorbing this information. The man she'd just married wasn't a poor stable hand, but a wealthy rancher. The business arrangement she'd proposed suddenly seemed far more complicated. "Why didn't you tell the marshal who you really are?" she asked finally. "Because I have no proof I'm Nathaniel King. All my documentation is back east. By the time I could send for it, I'd be long dead." He met her eyes. "And because revealing my identity would tip off Blackwood. He'd hide his tracks, and I'd never be able to prove what he's done. So what do you intend to do now?" "Get my proof. Bring Blackwood to justice. Save my ranch." He paused. "And then figure out how to repay the debt I owe you." Eleanor shook her head. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Carter." "Nathan." "Nathan." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "You owe me nothing. I did what I thought was right. That's payment enough." He stood as well, and suddenly the parlor seemed much smaller. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, could smell the soap he'd used to wash. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "no one has ever done something so selflessly for me. Not in my entire life. You risk your reputation, your safety, your future for a stranger. That's not something I'll forget or take lightly." Heat crept up Eleanor's neck. She stepped back, putting distance between them. "I'll show you to your room. We both need rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As she lay in her own bed later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor wondered what she'd gotten herself into. She'd married a wealthy rancher in disguise, thwarted a criminal scheme she didn't fully understand, and tied her life to a man who would undoubtedly leave once he'd settled his business. But when she closed her eyes, she kept seeing the way Nathan had looked at her during their brief wedding ceremony. Not with pity or gratitude, but with something that looked almost like respect. It was more than she had ever hoped for.
Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Confused, she threw on her wrapper and hurried to the kitchen, where she found Nathan standing at her stove, cooking breakfast with the casual competence of a man accustomed to fending for himself. He glanced up when she entered, a slight smile crossing his face. "Good morning. I hope you don't mind. I'm used to being up before dawn." Eleanor was acutely aware of her unbound hair, her nightclothes, the impropriety of standing in her kitchen with a man she barely knew, even if that man was, technically, her husband. No, I don't mind." She pulled her wrapper tighter. "I'll just—" "Eleanor." His voice stopped her at the doorway. When she turned, he was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to be uncomfortable in your own home. I'm the interloper here, not you." Something in his tone, a gentleness, understanding, made her shoulders relax slightly. She nodded and moved to the small table, settling into a chair. Nathan set a plate before her, and Eleanor blinked in surprise. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the bacon crisp but not burned, and he'd even managed to find the jar of preserves she'd made last summer. "You cook," she observed. "I spent 2 years on a cattle drive when I was younger. You learn to cook, or you go hungry." He sat across from her with his own plate. "My Eastern friends would be horrified to know I can make a decent meal over a campfire." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Eleanor spoke. We need to discuss your situation. If Cyrus believes you're dead, he doesn't. By now he'll know about the wedding, about the old law you invoked. He'll be furious." Eleanor set down her fork. "Will he come after you?" "Possibly. But more likely he'll try to discredit me, to finish what he started by ruining my reputation so thoroughly that anything I say against him will be dismissed." Nathan's jaw tightened. "And he might try to hurt you by hurting you. I can take care of myself." "I don't doubt that, but I'd feel better if you weren't alone. Is there somewhere you could stay? Someone who could—" "Absolutely not." Eleanor's voice was firm. "This is my home, and I'm not going to be driven from it by threats and intimidation. Besides, if I run and hide, it will only make Cyrus bolder." Nathan studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something that might have been admiration flicker in his eyes. "You're a stubborn woman, Eleanor Whitmore." "Eleanor Carter," she corrected without thinking, then felt heat flood her cheeks. His expression softened. "Eleanor Carter," he repeated quietly. A knock at the door broke the moment. Nathan rose instantly, his hand moving to his hip where a gun would have been if he'd been wearing one. Eleanor laid a hand on his arm. "It's probably just my father." But when she opened the door, it wasn't George Whitmore standing on her porch. It was Cyrus Blackwood, his hat in his hands, his expression a careful mask of concern. "Miss Whitmore, pardon me, Mrs. Carter." His voice dripped with false sympathy. "I heard about your wedding. I wanted to come by and make sure you were all right."
Eleanor felt Nathan move to stand behind her, felt the tension radiating from him. She kept her own expression pleasantly neutral. "How thoughtful of you, Mr. Blackwood. As you can see, I'm perfectly fine." Cyrus's gaze shifted to Nathan, and Eleanor saw the hatred flash in his eyes before he controlled it. "Carter, I'm surprised to see you're still breathing." "I'm full of surprises." Nathan's voice was level, almost pleasant, but with an undercurrent of steel. "That wedding was legal," Eleanor said firmly. "Marshal Brennan verified the law himself." "Oh, I'm sure it was legal." Cyrus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Though I have to wonder what would make a respectable woman like yourself marry a cattle thief, unless—" His gaze raked over Eleanor's figure in a way that made her skin crawl. "Unless there were other reasons, intimate reasons." Nathan moved so fast Eleanor barely saw it. One moment he was behind her, the next he had Cyrus by the shirt front, slamming him against the porch post. "Speak to my wife that way again," Nathan said softly, dangerously, "and the law won't save you from me." Cyrus's face flushed red, but Eleanor saw fear flicker in his eyes. For all his bluster, he recognized a dangerous man when he saw one. "Nathan," Eleanor's voice was calm but commanding, "let him go." For a moment she thought Nathan might refuse. Then he released Cyrus with a slight shove that sent the foreman stumbling backward. Cyrus straightened his shirt, his expression ugly. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor, both of you. The Twisted K is falling apart, and when it does, there won't be any work for drifters or charity for foolish women who throw their lives away on them. The Twisted K is falling apart because you've been stealing from it for years, and I'm going to prove it." Cyrus went very still. "That's a serious accusation, Carter, one you can't back up." "We'll see." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, and Eleanor felt the weight of the conflict between them, a conflict that went deeper than stolen cattle or false accusations. Finally, Cyrus jammed his hat back on his head. "You've made your bed, Eleanor. Both of you. I hope you're prepared to lie in it." He stalked off the porch, mounted his horse, and rode away at a gallop. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "That went well," she said dryly. Nathan turned to her, and she was startled to see concern in his eyes rather than anger. "Did he hurt you?" What he implied was crude and disgusting, but nothing I haven't heard before. Eleanor moved back into the house, needing space, needing to hide the hurt that Cyrus's words had caused, despite her best efforts to remain unaffected. Men like Cyrus Blackwood think that women like me should be grateful for any attention, no matter how vile. Women like you, Nathan's voice held an edge.
Eleanor turned to face him, lifting her chin. Fat women, Mr. Carter. Plain women. Women past their prime who should know better than to reach above their station. That's not... He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Eleanor, the only thing Cyrus Blackwood's words reveal is his own ugliness, not yours. Pretty sentiments, but we both know the truth. I'm not a woman men marry for love or desire. I'm practical, useful, and conveniently positioned to save your life. She moved toward the kitchen, needing to do something with her hands. Which is fine. I went into this arrangement with my eyes open. Nathan followed her. Is that really what you think? That you have nothing to offer beyond usefulness? I think that I'm 32 years old and I've lived in this town my entire life. I know exactly how people see me. She began clearing the breakfast dishes with more force than necessary. I've made my peace with it. Well, I haven't. The quiet intensity of his words made her pause. When she turned, he was standing in the doorway, his expression serious. I haven't made peace with the world being so cruel and so blind. You saved my life yesterday, Eleanor, not because you stood to gain anything from it, but because you thought it was right. You stood up to a marshal, to a town's expectations, to your own father's concerns. You did something brave and selfless and remarkable. He took a step closer. That's not useful. That's extraordinary. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. You don't have to say these things. I'm not saying them because I have to. I'm saying them because they're true. He paused, then added softly, and because I suspect no one has ever said them to you before, which is a damn shame.
For a long moment, they stood there in her small kitchen, the morning light slanting through the windows, the world outside carrying on as if everything hadn't just shifted somehow. Finally, Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Nathan seemed to understand. He moved back to the table, giving her space, changing the subject to practical matters. I need to get to the ranch records, he said. The shipping manifests, the accounts. If I can compare what Blackwood reported to what was actually sold, I'll have proof of the theft. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, grateful for the return to concrete problems she could solve. Those records would be kept at the ranch office, wouldn't they? Yes, but Blackwood will be watching for me now. Then we need a distraction. Eleanor's mind was already racing through possibilities. Or better yet, a reason for me to be at the ranch, one that wouldn't raise suspicion. Nathan's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that tomorrow is Sunday, and on Sundays, the church ladies deliver meals to the ranch hands who can't make it to services. She smiled slightly. I'm thinking that as a newly married woman, I might want to introduce my husband to the community. What better way than to accompany the meal deliveries? A slow smile spread across Nathan's face. You're brilliant, you know that? Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at the admiration in his voice. I have my moments.
Sunday dawned clear and bright, with a breeze that carried the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best Sunday dress, a deep blue cotton that her mother had always said brought out her eyes, and pinned her hair up with more care than usual. When she emerged from her room, she found Nathan waiting in the parlor, dressed in clean clothes that must have belonged to her father. The shirt was slightly too large, but on him it simply looked comfortable,
and he'd somehow managed to make himself look respectable despite the rough fabric. "You look lovely," he said, and there was no flattery in his tone, just simple observation. Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck. "Thank you. You look very presentable yourself." They loaded the wagon with covered dishes and baskets of bread that Eleanor and several other church ladies had prepared the day before. As they drove through town toward the church, Eleanor was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. "Town's in an uproar about us," Nathan observed quietly. "Did you expect otherwise?" "No, but I hate that you're bearing the brunt of it." Eleanor shrugged. "I've been the subject of town gossip before. I'll survive it again." At the church, they met up with the other ladies participating in the meal delivery. Sarah Henderson, the banker's wife, gave Eleanor a tight-lipped smile. "Eleanor, and this must be your husband." "Nathan Carter," Nathan said smoothly, tipping his hat. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Henderson." "Yes. Well." Sarah's gaze flickered over Eleanor with barely concealed disapproval. "Quite a whirlwind courtship you two had." "When you know," Eleanor said pleasantly, linking her arm through Nathan's with a boldness that surprised herself. The drive to the Twisted K took 30 minutes, and Eleanor used the time to go over the ranch's layout based on what she remembered from previous visits.
"The ranch office is in the main house," she explained. "Cyrus has rooms there since he's the foreman. The hands bunk in the long building behind the main house, and the cooking and meal preparation happens in a separate kitchen building." "Will Cyrus be there?" "Likely not. He usually rides fence lines on Sundays, checking for breaks or problems. He's meticulous about some things, even if he's a thief." As they pulled up to the ranch, Eleanor felt Nathan tense beside her. She understood. This was his property, his legacy, and he was entering it as a stranger, an imposter in his own home. The meal delivery went smoothly at first. The ranch hands, a mix of younger men and weathered cowboys, were grateful for the home-cooked food and politely curious about Eleanor's new husband. Nathan played his part perfectly, quiet, deferential, careful not to show too much knowledge about ranch operations. Eleanor caught the eye of Mary Chen, another of the church ladies, and gave her a subtle nod. Mary, bless her, immediately launched into an enthusiastic monologue about her daughter's upcoming wedding, drawing the attention of everyone in the dining area. "Now," Eleanor murmured to Nathan. They slipped away from the group, moving quickly toward the main house. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as they climbed the steps to the wide front porch. The door was unlocked. Ranch houses rarely were locked during daylight hours, and they stepped inside. The interior was dusty and neglected, so different from what Nathan remembered. He moved through the house like a ghost, and Eleanor followed, keeping watch. The office was at the back of the house, a large room with windows overlooking the corrals. Nathan went straight to the desk, pulling open drawers with practiced efficiency. "The manifest should be in the ledger," he muttered, rifling through papers. "Blackwood's too arrogant to hide everything. He thinks no one would dare question him." Eleanor stationed herself by the door, listening for footsteps. Minutes ticked by. She could hear the murmur of voices from the direction of the bunkhouse, the sounds of horses in the corral. "Got it," Nathan said triumphantly. He held up a leather-bound ledger. "These numbers don't match. Look, he's reporting sales of 200 head per quarter, but the actual sales," he flipped to another section, "are closer to 300. He's pocketing the difference." "Take it," Eleanor urged. "We need to go." Nathan tucked the ledger inside his shirt, began to straighten the desk, and froze. Eleanor heard it too. Footsteps on the front porch, heavy and deliberate. "Someone's been in here. I can feel it." Eleanor's mind raced. They were trapped. The only way out was through the front of the house where Cyrus was. The windows? Too high, too obvious. Nathan grabbed her hand, pulling her toward a door she hadn't noticed. A closet, she realized, as he pulled her inside and closed the door quietly behind them. The space was tiny, meant for coats and boots. Eleanor found herself pressed against Nathan's chest, his arms around her to make room in the cramped quarters. She could feel his heart beating against her cheek, could feel the tension in his body. Footsteps entered the office. Through the slats in the closet door, Eleanor could see Cyrus's bulky form as he moved to the desk. He stood there for a long moment, studying it. "I know you're here somewhere, Carter," he called out. "Did you really think you could sneak onto my ranch?" His ranch. The presumption of it made Eleanor's blood boil. She felt Nathan's hand tighten on her shoulder, a warning to stay still, stay quiet. Cyrus moved around the office, and Eleanor held her breath as he approached the closet. His hand reached for the door handle. "Mr. Blackwood," a voice called from outside, one of the ranch hands. "Sir, there's a problem with the north fence. Looks like someone cut the wire." Cyrus hesitated, his hand still on the door handle. Eleanor could see his face through the slats, could see the indecision there. Finally, he swore under his breath and strode from the room. They waited, hardly breathing, until they heard the front door slam and the sound of a horse galloping away. Even then, Nathan held Eleanor still for another minute, listening, making sure. "All right," he whispered finally. "Let's go, quickly." They emerged from the closet, and Eleanor realized she was trembling, not just from fear, but from the closeness, the intimacy of being held in Nathan's arms. She pushed the feeling aside as they hurried from the house. The other church ladies were loading back into their wagons, and Eleanor and Nathan joined them, acting as if they'd simply been exploring the grounds. If anyone noticed their slightly disheveled appearance or Eleanor's flushed cheeks, they were too polite to comment. As they drove away from the Twisted K, the stolen ledger hidden beneath their wagon seat, Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe. "That was too close," she said. Nathan glanced at her, and she was surprised to see a slight smile on his face. "You were magnificent, calm under pressure. I couldn't have asked for a better partner in crime." "I'll add that to my list of accomplishments, along with saving your life and cooking a tolerable pot roast." "I'm sure your pot roast is more than tolerable. You'll have the chance to judge for yourself tonight." As they drove back to town, Eleanor realized with a start that somewhere between the wedding and the close call at the ranch, something had shifted. Nathan no longer felt like a stranger she'd married out of duty. He felt like an ally, perhaps even a friend. It was more than she had expected, and far more dangerous to her guarded heart. The following days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Nathan spent his mornings helping George at the store, learning the business and making himself useful while keeping a low profile. In the afternoons, he and Eleanor would sit at the kitchen table, poring over the stolen ledger, documenting every discrepancy, every theft. 3 years, Nathan said one afternoon, his voice tight with anger. "He's been stealing from me for 3 years, and I was too busy with Eastern business interests to notice." Eleanor looked up from the notes she'd been transcribing. "You couldn't have known. I should have known. This ranch, it was my father's pride, my grandfather's legacy, and I abandoned it." He pushed back from the table, moving to stare out the window at the prairie beyond. "I was so eager to prove myself in the East, to show that I was more than just a cattleman's son, that I neglected the thing that mattered most." Eleanor set down her pen and moved to stand beside him. They'd grown comfortable with each other's presence over the past few days, comfortable enough that the silence between them was companionable rather than awkward. We all make choices we regret. The question is what we do about them once we realize our mistake. Nathan turned to look at her, and Eleanor was struck again by how the afternoon light caught in his gray eyes, making them look like smoke and silver. "Is that what this is for you? A choice you regret?" "Marrying you?" She considered the question seriously. No, I don't regret it. Even though it's made you the subject of gossip? Even though Cyrus has made veiled threats?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "Mr. Carter, Nathan, I've been the subject of gossip my entire life. The fat girl who couldn't catch a husband, the spinster who runs her father's store with too much authority for a woman.
the charitable soul who wastes her time on good works because no man wants her. She met his gaze steadily. At least now I'm being gossiped about for doing something that matters, for saving a life. That's a vast improvement. Nathan's expression shifted, softening into something Eleanor couldn't quite name. He reached out, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he might touch her face. Instead, his hand settled on her shoulder, warm and solid through the fabric of her dress. "You saved more than my life, Eleanor. You're giving me the chance to save my ranch, my family's legacy. That's no small thing." Before Eleanor could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Nathan's hand fell away, and Eleanor felt the loss of it like a physical thing. At the door, she found Marshal Tom Brennan, his expression grave. "Eleanor, Nathan, I need to speak with you both." They settled in the parlor, and Tom removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a nervous gesture Eleanor had known since childhood.
"I've been hearing things," he began, "concerning things. Cyrus Blackwood has been spreading word that you, Nathan, have been seen sneaking around the Twisted K. He's saying you're planning to finish what you started, to steal more cattle and frame him for it." "That's ridiculous," Eleanor said sharply. "I know it is, but Cyrus has influence in this town and people are starting to listen." Tom looked at Nathan. He's also been hinting that the marriage might not be legitimate, that Eleanor was coerced or confused. Eleanor felt anger flash hot through her veins. "I am neither coerced nor confused, Tom Brennan, and you can tell anyone who suggests otherwise that they can speak to me directly." "I know, Ellie, but I wanted to warn you. There's talk of having the marriage annulled, of claiming Nathan took advantage of your good nature." Nathan's jaw tightened. Let them try. Eleanor entered into this marriage of her own free will, with full knowledge and legal standing. "There's more," Tom said reluctantly. "Cyrus has filed a complaint with the county judge. He's claiming that Nathan has been making false accusations against him, trying to damage his reputation. The judge has agreed to hear the case next week." Eleanor and Nathan exchanged glances. This was Cyrus's next move, to discredit Nathan publicly before he could present his evidence. After Tom left, Nathan began pacing the parlor like a caged animal. "He's backing me into a corner. If I present the ledger evidence now, before I have additional proof, a good lawyer could claim it was falsified. But if I wait, then he destroys your credibility first," Eleanor finished. She thought for a moment, then made a decision. "We need more than the ledger. We need witnesses, someone who's seen what Cyrus has been doing. The ranch hands are too afraid of losing their jobs to speak out." Not the ranch hands. Eleanor's mind was working through the problem systematically, the way she approached any challenge. The buyers, the cattle brokers who've been purchasing from the Twisted K. If Cyrus has been selling more cattle than he's reporting, those buyers will have records of their own. Nathan stopped pacing, looking at her with something like wonder. "The broker in Fort Worth, Mitchell & Sons, they handle most of the Twisted K business. Then we need to get to Fort Worth and get those records. That's 2 days' travel each way, and if Cyrus finds out we've gone, then we don't tell anyone." Eleanor straightened her spine. "We leave tonight. Tell my father we're visiting my aunt in Millbrook. It's in the opposite direction, so if Cyrus checks, it will throw us off our trail. We can be back in 4 days with the proof you need." Nathan studied her for a long moment. "This isn't your fight, Eleanor. You've already done more than anyone could ask." "You're my husband," Eleanor said simply. "Of course it's my fight." The word husband hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Nathan nodded slowly. "Then we leave at midnight. Pack light. We'll need to move fast."
They left in the dead of night, the wagon wheels muffled with rags to dampen the sound. Eleanor had packed food and supplies, as well as a change of clothes for them both. Nathan drove, and Eleanor sat beside him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the night chill.
The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant and cold, and the prairie stretched out around them like a dark sea. Eleanor had never traveled at night like this, had never done anything so daring or potentially foolish, but she felt no fear, only a strange exhilaration. "Tell me about your life before you came here," she said, after they had been traveling for an hour. "Your real life." Nathan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I was groomed to take over the family business. Cattle, land, investments. But I always felt like I was living in my father's shadow. He was larger than life, strong, decisive, beloved by everyone who knew him." He paused. "When he died, I couldn't face stepping into his shoes here, so I went east, threw myself into other ventures. I told myself I was expanding the family interests, but really I was running away." "From what?" "From not being him. From knowing I could never measure up." Nathan's hands tightened on the reins. "The irony is, by running away, I nearly destroyed everything he built." Eleanor understood that kind of fear, the fear of not being enough, of falling short of expectations. "But you came back," she said. "When it mattered, you came back." "I came back too late." "You came back exactly when you needed to. Any sooner, and you might not have discovered what Cyrus was doing. Any later, and the ranch would have been beyond saving." She shifted the blanket, leaning slightly against his shoulder. "Sometimes timing is everything." He glanced down at her, a slight smile touching his lips. "Are you always this philosophical at 2 a.m? "Only when I'm committing minor acts of deception and traveling across the prairie with a man I've known less than a week." Nathan laughed, a genuine sound that made Eleanor's chest warm. "When you put it that way, it does sound rather mad." "Completely mad," Eleanor agreed, "which is probably why I'm enjoying it so much." They traveled through the night and into the next day, stopping only to rest the horses and eat cold meals from Eleanor's supplies. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature rose, and Eleanor loosened the color of her dress, fanning herself with her hand.
"There's a creek about 5 miles ahead," Nathan said. "We can stop there, let the horses drink, and cool off." The creek was a ribbon of silver cutting through the brown prairie grass. Trees grew along its banks, cottonwoods and willows that provided blessed shade. Nathan helped Eleanor down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure on her waist, and she felt the now familiar flutter in her stomach at his touch. While Nathan tended to the horses, Eleanor walked to the creek's edge, kneeling to splash cool water on her face and neck. The water felt glorious, and she was tempted to wade in fully clothed. "You should rest," Nathan said, coming to stand beside her. "We'll stay here for a few hours, travel again this evening when it's cooler." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of how tired she was. They settled under one of the larger cottonwoods, and Nathan spread out a blanket. Eleanor sat with her back against the tree trunk, closing her eyes. When she woke, the sun had moved significantly across the sky, and she realized with a start that her head had somehow ended up on Nathan's shoulder. He was sitting very still, one arm positioned so she could lean against him comfortably. Eleanor started to sit up, mortified, but Nathan's quiet voice stopped her. "Don't. You were sleeping peacefully." "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, Eleanor." He shifted slightly so he could see her face. "Stop apologizing. I didn't mind." She met his eyes, saw the truth of it there, and something inside her chest tightened. This was dangerous territory. She'd married this man knowing it was temporary, knowing he would leave once his business was settled. She couldn't afford to let herself hope for more. But oh, how she wanted to. "We should probably start moving again," she said, her voice not quite steady. Nathan nodded, but his gaze lingered on her face for a moment longer before he stood and offered her his hand. They reached Fort Worth late the following afternoon, tired and dusty, but determined. Nathan had been to the city before, in his other life, and he navigated the busy streets with confidence. Mitchell and Sons occupied a substantial building near the stockyards. Nathan paused outside, taking a deep breath. "Ready?" Eleanor asked. "As I'll ever be."
Mr. Mitchell is very busy. Tell him Nathaniel King is here to discuss discrepancies in his ranch's cattle sales." The clerk's eyes widened. He scurried off, returning moments later with an older gentleman whose weathered face broke into a surprised smile. "Nathaniel King? Good God, boy, we thought you'd died or disappeared. Your foreman said you'd given up the ranch, moved back east permanently." "My foreman has been telling a lot of lies," Nathan said grimly. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to see all the records of cattle purchases from the Twisted K for the past 3 years. Mitchell's expression grew serious. "Come with me." In Mitchell's private office, they spread out ledgers and bills of sale. The evidence was damning. Cyrus had been selling significantly more cattle than he'd been reporting to Nathan, pocketing the difference. "I never questioned it," Mitchell said, shaking his head. "Blackwood had your signature on the authorization letters. Or what I thought was your signature." "Forgery," Nathan said flatly, "added to theft and attempted murder." Eleanor had been studying the numbers, her merchant's mind tallying figures. "He's stolen over $50,000 in 3 years, she said quietly, "enough to ruin the ranch." Mitchell agreed to provide written testimony and copies of all relevant documents. As the sun set, Nathan and Eleanor left his office with a leather satchel full of proof. "We did it," Eleanor said, hardly believing it. "We actually did it." Nathan stopped in the middle of the busy street, turned to her, and before Eleanor could process what was happening, he pulled her into a tight embrace. "We did," he said into her hair. "Thank you. Thank you for believing in me, for doing this." Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the feel of his arms around her, the solid warmth of his body, the way her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he must feel it. Slowly, carefully, she let herself return the embrace, her arms wrapping around his waist. They stood there for a long moment, two dusty travelers in the middle of a busy street, holding each other as if the world might try to tear them apart. When they finally separated, Nathan's expression was strange, surprised, perhaps, or confused. Eleanor stepped back quickly, smoothing her skirts, trying to regain her equilibrium. "We should find lodgings for the night, start back early tomorrow." "Eleanor, it's getting late. We should hurry." She walked ahead quickly, not wanting him to see the tears that had suddenly pricked at her eyes, because in that moment, held in Nathan's arms, she had felt something she'd never expected to feel. Cherished, wanted, cared for. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that when this was all over, and Nathan reclaimed his ranch and his life, losing him was going to break her heart.
They found rooms at a modest but respectable boarding house. Eleanor barely slept that night, too aware of Nathan in the room next to hers, too aware of the way everything had shifted between them in that embrace. She'd been a fool. She'd known better than to let her heart become involved, but somewhere between saving his life and stealing evidence from his ranch, she'd fallen for Nathan Carter, or Nathaniel King, or whoever he really was. In the morning, they began the journey home. Nathan was quiet, seemed preoccupied, and Eleanor told herself it was simply worry about the confrontation to come with Cyrus. They were a half-day from Redemption Creek when they saw the smoke. Nathan stood in the wagon, shading his eyes. "That's coming from town, or near it." Eleanor felt dread settle in her stomach like a stone. They urged the horses faster, the wagon rattling over the rutted road. As they crested the final hill overlooking the valley where Redemption Creek sat, Eleanor's worst fears were confirmed. Her father's store,
Her home was engulfed in flames. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Nathan drove the wagon recklessly down the hill, pulling up at the edge of town where a crowd had gathered. Eleanor jumped down before the wagon had fully stopped, pushing through the people. Her father stood in the street, his face smudged with soot, watching as the fire brigade threw bucket after bucket of water onto the blaze. It was hopeless. The building was old, dry wood, and the fire had been burning for some time. "Papa!" Eleanor threw her arms around him, checking him for injuries. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "I'm fine, girl, fine." George hugged her tightly. "Fire started in the middle of the night. I was staying above the store, heard the crackle, barely got out in time." "How did it start?" George's expression hardened. "It didn't start on its own. Someone threw a torch through the window, then barred the doors from outside. If I hadn't woken when I did." Nathan had joined them, his face grim. "Cyrus." "Can't prove it," Marshal Brennan said, appearing at Eleanor's elbow. "But yes, I'd wager my badge it was Cyrus or someone working for him. This happened about an hour after word got out that you two had gone to Fort Worth." Eleanor watched as everything she'd known, everything her mother had built and her father had maintained, burned to ash. Years of memories, of hard work, of life, gone in minutes.
She felt Nathan's hand on her shoulder and leaned into the comfort without thinking. Around them, she could hear the whispers, could see the looks. "This is your fault," someone muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Ever since you married that thief, nothing but trouble." Eleanor straightened, turned to face the speaker, Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. "My husband is not a thief, and this fire was set by the real criminal in this town, a man who's been stealing from the Twisted K for years." "Bold claims from a desperate woman," another voice said. Eleanor recognized James Porter, who owned the saloon. He'd always been friendly with Cyrus. Nathan stepped forward, the leather satchel in his hand. "Not claims, facts. Documented facts from Mitchell & Sons in Fort Worth showing years of cattle sales that were never reported. Forged authorization letters. Theft on a massive scale. And we're supposed to believe you?" Mrs. Henderson's voice dripped with contempt. "You, who came here as a drifter and somehow convinced poor Eleanor to throw her life away on you?" "You don't have to believe me," Nathan said quietly. "You just have to believe the evidence. And you have to ask yourselves why, if I'm the criminal here, Cyrus Blackwood felt the need to burn down my wife's home." A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor saw doubt on some faces, consideration on others. Marshal Brennan held out his hand. "Let me see those documents." Nathan handed over the satchel. Tom spent several minutes examining the contents, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up. "This is enough to bring Cyrus in for questioning, more than enough." He looked at Eleanor, his old eyes sad. "I'm sorry, Ellie. Sorry I didn't see what was happening sooner. Just make it right now, Tom. That's all I ask." Within an hour, a posse had been formed to ride to the Twisted K and bring in Cyrus Blackwood. Eleanor and Nathan stood in the street, watching the last of the fire die to smoking embers. Everything she owned was gone. "I'm sorry," Nathan said quietly. "This is my fault. If I hadn't involved you—" "Stop." Eleanor's voice was firm despite her exhaustion. "This is Cyrus's fault, his alone, and he's going to pay for it." Nathan looked at her, and Eleanor saw something raw and honest in his eyes. "Where will you go? You and your father?" "The church has spare rooms. We'll manage." "No," Nathan's voice was decisive. "You'll come to the Twisted K, both of you. It's my ranch, my home, and you're my wife." The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to maintain her independence, but the truth was she had nowhere else to go. And more than that, the thought of being separated from Nathan now, after everything they'd been through, made her chest ache. "All right," she said softly. "We'll come." The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity. Cyrus Blackwood had fled when he'd heard the posse was coming, but he hadn't gotten far.
He was caught trying to cross the border into Mexico, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The county judge had no choice but to order him held for trial. With Cyrus in custody, Nathan revealed his true identity to the town. The reaction was mixed: shock, embarrassment from those who doubted him, and grudging respect from others. The ranch hands at the Twisted K were relieved to learn their true boss had returned and that their jobs were secure. Eleanor and her father moved to the main house at the ranch. George took a small room on the first floor, while Eleanor found herself in the master bedroom, a large space with windows overlooking the prairie and a four-poster bed that seemed enormous after her small room in town. Nathan took a different room down the hall, maintaining the fiction that their marriage was in name only. But Eleanor noticed how his gaze would linger on her at dinner, how he would find excuses to stand close to her, how his hand would brush hers when they reached for the same thing. A week after they'd moved to the ranch, Eleanor was in the garden behind the main house, trying to salvage the neglected vegetable beds that had once been someone's pride. She was on her knees in the dirt pulling weeds when she heard footsteps behind her. Nathan stood there, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hat in his hands. "I've been looking for you." Eleanor sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair out of her face and undoubtedly smearing dirt across her cheek in the process. "I thought I'd try to bring this garden back to life. It's a shame to let it go to waste." Nathan knelt beside her, his long fingers gentle as they touched the tomato plant she'd been working to free from the choking weeds. "My grandmother planted this garden. She loved growing things. I wish I could have known her. She would have loved you." Nathan's voice was soft. "She valued practicality and kindness and courage, all the things you have in abundance." Eleanor felt heat creep into her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "Nathan," he turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious. "The marriage, our marriage, it doesn't have to end." Eleanor's heart stuttered. "What?" "I know we entered into this as a business arrangement, a way to save my life, but Eleanor," he reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Over these past weeks, you've become the most important person in my life, not because you saved me, but because of who you are. Your strength, your intelligence, your compassion, the way you see problems and solve them, the way you laugh when something genuinely amuses you, the way you care for people even when they don't deserve it."
Nathan, Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "I'm not. You don't have to say these things. You're free now. You can have any woman." "I don't want any woman." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "I want you. Only you. I think I started falling for you the moment you walked into that jail cell and offered to marry a condemned stranger, and I know I'm completely gone for you now." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "You can't mean this. Look at me, Nathan. Really look at me. I'm fat. I'm plain." "You're beautiful," he interrupted fiercely. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known, not despite who you are, Eleanor, but because of it, because every inch of you is honest and real and perfectly yourself." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I know I have no right to ask this. You married me to save my life, not to be tied to me forever. If you want your freedom, I'll understand. I'll arrange an annulment, set you and your father up with a new store, make sure you're provided for. But Eleanor, if there's any chance at all that you might want to stay, not as a business arrangement, but as my true wife." Eleanor's hands came up to frame his face, her fingers trembling. "You fool," she whispered. "You beautiful, wonderful fool. I've been falling for you since you kissed my hand at our wedding. I've been terrified that when you got your life back, you'd leave, and I'd be left with a broken heart and memories of what could have been." Nathan's eyes widened, hope blazing bright in them. I mean, I love you, Eleanor said, the words spilling out now that she'd started, unstoppable. I love your strength and your honor. I love the way you make me laugh. I love how you see me, really see me, not as the fat spinster everyone else sees, but as someone worthwhile, someone valuable. I love you, Nathan, and I want nothing more than to stay here with you, to build this ranch back to what it should be with you, to be your wife in every way. For a moment, Nathan simply stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then he closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was nothing like Eleanor had imagined a first kiss would be. It was better, deeper, more real, more desperately tender. His lips were warm and slightly chapped from the sun, and he kissed her like she was precious, like she was everything he'd ever wanted. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers once more. "Marry me," he said. "Really marry me, not to save my life, but because you want to spend your life with me, because I want to spend every day for the rest of my life earning the gift you've given me." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "You're already married, you fool." "Then let me ask you properly." He pulled back, took both her dirty, work-worn hands in his. "Eleanor Whitmore Carter, will you stay my wife? Will you build this ranch back to what it should be with me? Will you let me spend the rest of my days showing you how extraordinary you are?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, to all of it. Yes." He kissed her again, and this time there was joy in it, and promise, and the beginning of something that felt like forever.
1 year later, Eleanor stood on the porch of the Twisted K's main house, her hand resting on the swell of her pregnant belly, watching as Nathan worked with a young horse in the corral. The ranch had been transformed over the past year. New fences, new buildings, cattle everywhere, and prosperity returning. They'd rebuilt the store in town, too, installed a manager to run it. George split his time between the ranch and the store, claiming he'd never been happier. Nathan caught sight of Eleanor and waved, his face breaking into the smile that still made her heart skip. He said something to the ranch hand helping him, then strode across the yard toward her. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, climbing the steps to pull her into his arms. "I've been resting all morning. I got bored." She leaned into him, letting him take some of her weight. "Besides, Dr. Morrison said light activity is good for me." "Light activity, not standing in the hot sun." Eleanor smiled, tilting her face up to kiss him. "You worry too much." "I worry exactly the right amount when it comes to you." His hand joined hers on her belly, his touch gentle. "Both of you." They stood there together, watching the sun paint the prairie gold and amber, and Eleanor thought about how much had changed in a year. She'd gone from spinster, shopkeeper, to rancher's wife, from believing no one could ever love her to being loved deeply and completely. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathan asked quietly. "Marrying me that night? Everything that came after?" Eleanor turned in his arms, taking his face in her hands. "Not for a single second. You gave me the life I never knew I wanted. You gave me love I never thought I'd have. You gave me a home." "You gave me all those things first," Nathan said. "You saved my life, Eleanor, in more ways than one." She kissed him, long and sweet, and felt their baby kick between them, a reminder of the future they were building together. "I love you," she murmured against his lips. "And I love you, my brave, beautiful, extraordinary wife." As the sun set over the Twisted K Ranch, Eleanor Carter stood in her husband's arms and knew with absolute certainty that she'd found exactly where she belonged.